Welcome everybody, good evening. My name is Dwayne Valkenberg. I'm from ISACA, and welcome to our first webinar from ISACA and NORIA. This one has been organized by our CSX Commission by Tanson. So Tanson, thank you for organizing this first webinar for 2021. Our first webinar, first square table, is regarding introducing Zero Trust Readiness and fitness from a strategy to operation perspective. First, the house rules. Be aware. This is the first time we're using Teams Live. Teams Live is a different version than Teams that you're familiar with. The reason for that we're using Teams Live is that on the ordinary Teams there's a capacity of 300. And we're growing and increasing, so we had to look for a new solution. The big difference is that you cannot ask questions directly by unmuting your microphone to the presenters. So if you have any questions, just ask them through the chat, and myself or Yuri or Hao, they will read your questions and will respond to them. There's also a prize question regarding to the best question, but Yuri will explain that further. So the speakers, as I said, Yuri Bobbert, Chief Security Officer from Antwerp, and he is also a professor at the Antwerp School of Management. And our other speaker, second speaker, is Hao Dinh, and a Senior Associate at EY, and together they will give this presentation, our first webinar. So yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne. So I'll make sure that I'll share my presentation and then do a double check with you guys if everybody can see the presentation full screen. So if you can do a thumbs up, Dwayne, that it's visible for everybody, then super, then we're good to go. So yeah, welcome everybody. I'm very delighted on behalf of EY with Hao Dinh and Antwerp and myself to welcome you in this webinar about Zero Trust from strategy to operation. Yeah, I'm Yuri Bobbert, currently the Chief Security Officer at Antwerp, a global managed security service provider with a focus on Zero Trust. We already have 12 years of implementation experience on Zero Trust, did hundreds of implementations. And next to that, the Academic Director for the Antwerp Management School, delivering executive master programs in IT risk, cybersecurity and architecture. Where we also in the Antwerp University also contribute a lot to the ISACA community. We have made an agenda, Hao and I, for today in terms of the content that we want to bring to you. First, we are going to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to Zero Trust. So we're discussing what is Zero Trust and predominantly also the why. Why should you bother implementing Zero Trust? I'm going to highlight a couple of important streams in Zero Trust and also the current flaws in Zero Trust approaches, which we have examined over the last couple of years. And next to that, Hao is going to explain a little bit about the journey of the implementation of Zero Trust, where we use the term Zero Trust readiness to fitness, to determine first how ready are you, and then to determine how fit are you to utilize Zero Trust. And next to that, we are going to give you a highlight of the Zero Trust technology portal that we have as Antwerp to make it more tangible for you as an audience. And as Dwayne mentioned, we are doing a rattle on 5 books that we have. So if you have good, sharp questions, put them in the chat. We'll discuss them later on and you can win this book, the new book Leading in Digital Security. So first of all, in general, the introduction in Zero Trust. Perhaps a couple of people already know the legacy of John Kindervag, started in 2010. Now, back then, working at Forrester as the thought leader of Zero Trust, where he had a couple of principles, and I'm going to repeat them just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the first one is you design your security from the inside out. That means that you're designing your security from the data in your organization, regardless where it sits. And so it's not the old school way of thinking that you have a perimeter surrounding your network where the outside world is untrusted and the inside world is trusted. In this case, you never trust anything, and you design the data and the security controls inside out, regardless of its location. The other one is least privilege, so only people that should have access to the data are allowed and authorized to access the data. And predominantly the data resides in segments. So we'll talk a lot about segments today. Those are the compartments that you put surrounding the critical data. And so everybody that has access to the segments needs to be verified and never trusted. That means that you have more traffic to inspect, because you want to inspect if the people that are accessing your segments are also checked, and if they are indeed verified. So that means you generate more event logging, and that event logging requires handling. So these are the basic principles set in 2010, and we've added those as onto it in our framework, and which we later on further established with EY. And there are three basic principles that we added to the traditional point of view that John Kindervag laid a foundation for in 2010. The first one is the administrative organization internal control. I assume that all ISACA members and all NOREA members immediately know what I mean with that. But it means that you have your security administration up to par when it comes to segmenting. So you know exactly in which segments are typical assets and what are the requirements for those assets. So that's the A we say. And of course, because there's a lot of events and that you need to handle, you also need to have automation there. So we're all talking about the security administration and automation. And next to that, we have more view now with the Zero Trust framework approach that we've developed on more what we call silent risk and residual risks. And I'll dive into that later on. And the last one was by the Digital Intelligence Agency in the US, where is predominantly embrace the breach. So assume you're being breached, but you need to make sure what do you do in terms of your response and your communication to stakeholders, because it has a positive influence if you can respond quickly, and it can have negative downsides, negative effects if you don't respond or you respond in a very slow manner. And this is all, Zero Trust is all about making sure that you can respond in a quickly manner. So since it is an ISACA NOREA event, the square table where you can also earn some PVE points, I'm also going to elaborate more from a theoretical perspective, but I'm definitely doing this because this is relevant when you're going to deal with Zero Trust. So I'm also referring to this model. This is the EDM model developed by the Van Solms brothers in South Africa during the high rise of cybercrime in South Africa, later on being adapted by ISACA and further on developed by the University of Antwerp. So we view the organization on three levels. That means that you have a strategic level, where most of the time the CEO or the CFO resides. You have a tactical level, typically senior management or executive management, and you have operational level. When you translate that to security, most of the time the CISO does not sit at the board, but has a large influence on the strategic level, either as an advisor, or it could be that he is end responsible and he also has an own team. And so he is in a strategic position, looking at the compass of the organization and giving directives to the technical and the operational level. The example that I'm going to use a couple of times also in this webinar is SSL encryption. And so as a CISO, you would like to require that the technical operation would turn on SSL inspection because of you want to inspect malicious traffic going in and out of your network. That means that you set the directive as a CISO, and you need to make sure that your operations is also doing that, and so configures the proxy in such a way that the traffic is indeed being filtered. And what we see also due to research is that there's a gap. There's almost a gap of 80%. So the CISO writes something in his policy or in his standard, but the operation is for some reason not turning it on due to latency, due to maintenance, whatever, or forget to turn it on again. But there is a large, what we call a knowing doing gap. We know we should do it, but we don't do it. And this gap causes what which we frame as the silent risk. On the operational level, you can, for example, think of technology that's gathering data and it aggregates that to the higher level to make sure that at the end of the year or at the end of the quarter, the CISO can get assurance over his entire environment. And nowadays you see a huge amount of tools arising over time due to acquisitions, due to, for example, CIOs. I rarely see CIOs, by the way, that have very success in, for example, decommissioning or rationalizing their landscape. But that's also a profession, getting rid of your old stuff, because in terms of security, that all contributes to a bigger digital footprint, and you want ideally get rid of the applications that you're not using. And by the way, also in terms of security tools, we also see a lot of security tools as point solutions, taking care of all processes or applications in the operation that don't collaborate or don't communicate with each other. The bad thing in this case is that if you have, for example, an event like a big data breach, or you have a large audit, that you, for example, need to collect all of those evidence out of these tools. And that's a very cumbersome task, specifically if you're having a breach. So why did we develop the Zero Trust framework? The framework approaches a couple of flaws that we've seen over time in the current approaches. But I'm first starting with the approach that we have to Zero Trust, and also to have a general point of view of how we look at Zero Trust. So basically you start always with identifying critical assets in the environment. So what is critical to my organization? It does not mean that we are, for example, talking about segmenting the environment in VLANs or DMZs, because that's more network architecture segmentation. We're talking more about data segmentation. So we're looking at the critical data that's residing in certain spaces, and we build logical segments surrounding it. Then we put security measures on it to make sure that, for example, the rules of always verify, never trust apply, and that, for example, all the traffic is being inspected. By enforcing those policies, you generate a lot of logs. And that means that you need to monitor and report on those logs. Downside of, for example, then Zero Trust is also that you need to deal with those logs. And you need to interpret it, you need to analyze, and you need to report on it. Biggest benefit of Zero Trust as well is also that you're ordering your environment. So the time that the CFO did his administration on a napkin is also passed. At the time that the CISO is doing his administration on Excel, this is also passed. And so administering your environment and documenting that environment is becoming key for the CISO. And of course for the CRO and the compliance departments. So what does this research brought us? And so we've examined approximately 200 sources over time. When you see two important streams, you see a consulting stream, ideally Gartner, Forrester, IDC, all talking about this is the way you should do it, assuming that the environment is perfect and that you have a greenfield scenario. On the other end, you have the vendor streams. You have Fortinet, Palo Alto Networks, Cisco, VMware, all preaching that they deliver technology for Zero Trust, and by switching it on, that you have potentially Zero Trust. Well, it's a utopia, because it's not just pushing a single button. We also learned that over 12 years of implementation of Zero Trust. So we have identified 4 major flaws in the current approaches. First of all, the lack of alignment with risk and security frameworks. The other one is there is no involvement of asset owners and board. Well, that's strange, because the asset owner normally is responsible for the data residing in those assets. And the other one, the last one, is the majority of the approaches is based upon the change, so making the implementation happen rather than the run. And of course, this is a far more important thing when you're running a large organization which needs to comply to certain regulation. So that's why we have addressed this specifically in the framework in terms of which we call time to fix the framework. So the alignment with risk and security frameworks like ISF, ISO, NEN, in the US with NIST, HIPAA. The other one is explicit sign-off on all the stakeholders involved in the segment, also in case of a breach, because you need to know very quickly who you need to inform when something's happened. And the other one is a very, very important focus and a heavy emphasis on the run, on your security operations. All with the ambition to make sure that Zero Trust contributes in a couple of things. It raises your security posture due to the fact that you you apply compartmentalization to your network. Therefore, it lowers the risk and it reduces the blast radius. If something happens in one compartment, it doesn't affect the others. It lowers the impact, but most of all, it also lowers your costs. Because applying Zero Trust is not a matter of buying new technology, because the majority of the technology nowadays can already utilize Zero Trust. The only thing is that you need to configure it in a proper manner. So together with EY, we developed an approach where EY takes most of the responsibility and ownership and the professional capabilities of applying Zero Trust on a strategic and managerial level when it comes to how ready are you? Consulting, professional services, project management, program management, that's something that EY does. And on the other end, we are, as On2it, specialized in running a security operation. We do that globally, 24/7, with 2 SOCs, one in the US and one in the Netherlands. And we do that based on an automated Intel platform. I'm going to demonstrate shortly how it works. So there's a distinction between the readiness and the fitness. Now I'm giving the word to Hao, and he's going to explain how a typical engagement would look like and what the end result of it will be.
Thank you, Yuri. So moving from strategy to operations, that's an important question, right? Because you want to implement what we've learned about Zero Trust in your organization, fitting to your organization. And the view on which how On2it and EY together sees the Zero Trust implementation is focusing on 3 levels: the governance level, the management level, and the operational level. And the governance level is linked to the Zero Trust strategy. And this strategy includes the organizational and business objectives. The Zero Trust strategy then should answer the question why and what do we want to achieve, by when, and with which resources. And a recommended practical step here is to perform a Zero Trust readiness assessment and determine the gaps between the future and current situation. From this, a high-level design and roadmap for the Zero Trust implementation follows, but more detail on that later. Moving to the management level, it focuses on the scoping of the implementation. We call these the Zero Trust insights, the heat map. So essentially these include to understand what are the critical value chains and logical segments within your organization. And important is that the security needs are mapped against the most important and selected segments. And this creates the understanding of the so-called protect service. And this layer, the management layer, actually links the strategy to the actual implementation. The operation pillar contains the practical implementation and execution of the designs and the plans. And once implemented, monitoring can support the steering and governance by providing rich logging and status information on each security measure per segment. And this level is where the knowledge is about Zero Trust. If we move on to the next slide, and you know, as you might sense, a Zero Trust strategy does not exist in any vacuum in your organization. There is, in one form or another, always a link to business, technology, other organizational or security objectives that needs to be reached. And a successful Zero Trust implementation requires alignment to these objectives and the strategy of the business. And so you need to understand you know, what you want to achieve in the future from a technology perspective, also from a business perspective, to link that to your Zero Trust. And an important misconception is that zero trust is only a security change, but it's clearly not. A practical example is one that many organizations are currently in, which is the move to the cloud. A business objective could be to increase flexibility or reduce throughput times in response to market requests. However, this flexibility actually comes with security challenges as well. From a security angle alone, one might say that with the high flexibility, the systems and locations where the data is stored will also become flexible in nature. So the protect service with that becomes very complex on itself, mostly because it becomes a challenge not only to identify, but then also to protect these assets. So an increasing focus must be placed on safeguarding, customer data across the multiplicity of the systems around the cloud. And zero trust is an effective way to adapt to, a changing protect service for any, future change that we might see. You can think about cloud, but also about containers, the DevOps movement, IoT, etc. You name it. Every business has their own specific changes, but clearly these technologies will bring more exposure points and many which will allow access to sensitive data where in the past they didn't have these. So zero trust helps to move along with these risks. Before we move into the next step, we'd like to address some misconceptions actually around zero trust and zero trust implementations. And there are 4 that we'd like to mention. So before we go into the 4-step approach, there are 4 misconceptions that we don't have the slide, but I think it's good to mention them shortly as well. The first is that zero trust is a purely technical endeavor, and in essence, there are technical components and considerations to be made. However, explained earlier is that zero trust is a security concept that should be aligned with both business objectives and technology objectives. And when approaching zero trust purely from a technical perspective, gaps will form in the design and therefore also in the implementation and the compliance levels. A second misconception is that zero trust requires a complete overhaul of the IT environment. As Yuri said, every organization has many systems in place. And zero trust should, at least our approach to zero trust, looks at enhancing these capabilities to also help organizations identify what can be leveraged, what can be reused, to fulfill also the need in identity and access management, the need in logging and monitoring, and how these can be used to the full extent instead of making the IT environment more complex. The third misconception is that zero trust segments are the same as network security segments, and segmentation is an important building block of zero trust, and it intends to segment the data, the applications, the assets, and the services together, DAS, and which share the same security needs. However, this is not purely about traffic. This is about combining these chains in a way that you can share the security needs so that you can protect them in a cost-effective way. And the final and last misconception is that it requires a Big Bang approach. And that's, for us, we always say, start small and enlarge your protect service by testing, by experimenting, by taking it segment by segment. Because zero trust is not something you turn on and off. Therefore, successful transformation requires careful consideration of the scope, technology, and the operations. and it requires testing, experimentation to be able to adapt and learn from these experiences. So, if we move on to the approach on how we approach the engagement by a typical transformation, we divide it into 4 different steps. The first is, what does your current state look like? With the current state, we mean, why it's important to mention the current state is because there are some fundamental requirements needed from a security perspective to be able to implement zero trust. After we identify what we have right now, we want, given the strategy that the organization has, we want to know where we want to be in the future. So setting that mark, that ambition on the roadmap. The third and very typical step for a zero trust is to identify the segments, to identify the data, the applications, the asset, and the services that share the same value chain, but also share the same security needs. Take these together and start implementing the security measures that are needed to get to the zero trust. And finally, there's always a gap between current state and future state, and to have that insight in whichever transformation, but also run it at the same time, and we'll cover that in a later bit. So if we zoom in on each of these steps, if we look at a zero trust roadmap, you want to know, what is important right now. Where are the security needs for my organization? These are, so we have listed 3 considerations that you can take to understand, okay, which are the most important segments, most important value chains that we can identify to move to the zero trust security framework. And you could start with the security needs, for example. Take the ones that are most critical for you, that process the most sensitive data, that require the highest amount of security measures to start with. Then the second question could be, how important is this business stream for me? Usually the sensitivity and the strategic importance are quite related, but it's not always the case. And third, what zero trust does very well is adapt to flexibility. So a value chain that requires a lot of flexibility in identity access management, in close logging and monitoring, in on-the-fly decision making, that's exactly where you want to be with starting your zero trust journey. If you go into the next, we'd like to focus a little bit on the security aspects of it, the security needs side of it. And as previously mentioned, zero trust is not a matter of buying hardware and switch it on and off. The zero trust security paradigm helps organizations ensure that anyone or anything trying to access the data is both authorized to do so, but even more so to trusted to do so based on the preset of data points. And it's mainly a practical way to segment the collection of systems in such a way that all systems are protected in a systematic and a consistent way. And this is, of course, not a theoretical exercise, but it's fully linked to the security strategy and framework of an organization. And data that's more critical should be protected in a more stringent manner. And additionally, the segments help organization to fully fulfill the right level of security without over or underspending on security for each of those segments. And additionally, as this exercise helps organizations to determine the right level of security for each of the segments, it becomes very clear that per each component included newly to the segments, the same accounts, right? So you enhance your your segment system by system. It can be seen as a design for the collection of measures for that specific segment. So not not each segments have their own security needs, and not all security measures are needed for each of the segments. If we move to the next, we can have a view on how we follow a typical transformation. So we talked about the current state already. We typically have a high level view on where to start, setting the maturity level on the right level, and put it in a system. So this is still static, right? This is an example view, but it has the high level security measures or groupings of measures that you could have on the right level. If you would move to the next, you will have more information on the segment level. So you also take into account not only the segments, not only the current state, but also the future state here. And this is a typical view of, for example, 5 segments. We selected 5 segments for a payment processor with multiple locations. We've identified the measures that should be in place for these segments, and we place a number of certain KPIs to it, importance, risk levels. We make it inside. So that's Yuri will also explain a little bit on what silent risks are. But a view like this will make the transformation insightful for everybody involved. If we go to the next, this is where the operation will start. So we have that clear view. We have the gaps from current situation to the next, and we have a dashboard where we can say, okay, these measures are now in place. These are not, and this will show the transformation from where did we want to go and where are we now. And here I would like to hand over back to Yuri, because he will explain how that looks. When we fulfill that transformation, we move on to the operational side of it.
Yeah, thanks, Hao. So I also wrote down a couple of questions that you put in the chat already. I think we have a very enthusiastic audience here, Hao, so they're all eager to win the book. But I hope I can also address a couple of those questions that were already put in the chat. One of the questions was also about how do you interpret an event. So you see here typical, this is a very simple, there's an event, there's a bear approaching a baby. This is an event. If we see this, we think, wow, but is this actually a threat? Because there's something between the baby and the bear. This is typically something that also happens in events that we extract from technology. So we make use of existing technology to ingest those logs into our technology platform. So this is an example of an AWS log being parsed to Palo Alto Networks into via Palo Alto Networks technology device, and this is a traditional log. Mainly, if I see, for example, an event, and I'm always using the example of a brute force attack on the outside of my environment, on my website, for example. If I see that event in my log, I only see a brute force attack. If I see the same event happening inside on my Active Directory, I see a brute force attack. That's the same event in the log. So it doesn't say me anything. The thing is that you want to enrich the log with a huge amount of other types of data. And you want to know where it's coming from. You want to know the MCAP. You want to know if it's a Tor access node. You want to know if there's certain threat data related to the event. Perhaps what's the source of IP, what's the destination IP. So you enrich the log, and that gives you the opportunity to determine, okay, what's required in terms of an action. And so we developed a platform, and that was also one of the questions: can you make use of AI to cater the analysis of a huge amount of logs that are generated based on zero trust? And that's typically what we do. And so we collect the log, we enrich it, and then take action. So it's a security automation and orchestration and response platform. So that means that from the millions of events that you receive every day on your environment, the majority is handled automatically. And there are a couple of residual events that we take into account, and an analyst looks at and puts that again in the machinery. So the neural network in the system trains itself in becoming more intelligent to handle events. And that means that we have a ratio now of 75,000 events that lead to one manual investigation. And so there's a huge amount of automatically handled events that we can deal with. So, and another question that I received, and I'm going to demonstrate it on the based on the how the portal looks like. This was the question of Johan Beuk, question about, do I still need to classify my data? Because that's something that you typically do before you set security measures, and that is something that you do, but we refer to the term relevance score. That means that you still have a CIA practice, because that's a existing practice most of the time in any organization, but you extend that based upon looking, okay, what type of data is going in and out of my segment, what are my regulatory requirements that I have there, and what are my minimal security measures that I need to take. And you administer that in the portal technology that you see here. So for each segment, you identify the data, the relevance of the data, in terms of the CIA rating, but also in terms of how relevant is this for my business when it comes to this segment. For example, if I'm a bank, then the SWIFT gateway is a very critical segment that always needs to have a certain RPO or an RTO time. So I give it a higher relevance score. What you see now is that this screen, what you see is the overall zero trust dashboard that we have in our portal. And what you see on the upper left corner is typically something like you see with your iWatch, an overall status of your health of your environment. On the right upper corner, you see the progress monitor. That's something that's specifically designed for NIST. And NIST did a call throughout the world to collaborate in zero trust initiatives. And we started that collaboration with NIST 2 years ago. And we started developing a zero trust implementation technology. And that's this portal. And they requested us, can you develop a monitor that keeps track of the progress of implementations of zero trust in our federal agents? So that's what you see here. You see over time the progress this organization is making when it comes to secure the strategic level, managerial level, and the operational level. And on the right lower corner, you see what we call the microsegment exposure score. That score basically says all the items, all the segments that are in red on the right upper corner, they are at risk. That means that they have a high relevance score, but they lack certain security measures that we have identified as critical to implement proper zero trust. And so it could be that there's a lack of identity and access management measures, or content inspection, or MFA, or data leakage prevention, or whatever, that's identified initially based upon the requirements that you set for the segment. And if the segment is at risk, so it has a low level of security measures, then it becomes in red. So this makes it also more easy for CISOs, for CROs to manage, not on events, not on devices, but it manages based on your critical segments, so the critical crown jewels. You see where you are at risk and where you should focus on. So if you zoom, this is a demo, these are demo slides, but if you actually look into the portal, you can zoom into the segment, you click on the segment, and you go immediately into the next section, and that is the segment. And so again, this is a slide that I present every week or every 2 weeks, a webinar called Zero Trust Readiness and Fitness, where I do a demonstration on this technology, and I'm going to dive into what we also do in our Security Operating Center in terms of event handling, incident handling, ticket handling, reporting, etc. That's a deep dive into the technology. But now I'll stick to a more high-level approach. So what you basically see is that this is the fitness score, and if I'm then zooming in to certain segments, I see, for example, that my ATM machines lack, for example, content inspection or behavioral analytics. So these are 8 zero trust measures that have approximately 5 to 6 sub-measures, in total 40 measures, and it's very easy to determine what do I need in this segment and what's turned on. This information is all extracted from logs from technology. It could be Palo Alto Networks, could be Cisco, could be Fortinet. We ingest logs, do the interpretation, and give you a display what is active. So again, the previous example that I gave you at the beginning, if I'm a CISO and I have in my policy something stated that I do SSL inspection, I can immediately see here if SSL inspection is indeed turned on in this segment. And that's the phrase that Hao also referred to, is that if you think you have it turned on, but it's basically in practice not turned on, that's what we refer to as a silent risk. And that's what, if you connect it to my earlier statement about the knowing-doing gap, we see with a lot of organizations there's a huge gap between what they write on the paper in terms of the policy and what they've implemented in practice. We see a lot of companies failing in default implementations of firewalls, unconfigured IPS systems, and that's something that you typically make visible via such a dashboard. So we're going to the key takeaways of this webinar, and before we close off, we want to highlight a couple of these important things. There was also a question from somebody who said, well, where can I begin? And how can I be most successful with Zero Trust? Well, starting very small, our experience with over 12 years of implementations of Zero Trust with hundreds of environments. We manage more than 400 customers worldwide when it comes to Zero Trust managed security services. Our experience is start very, very small. So start with 5 and learning how do I segment, how do I determine measures, how can I align with my risk and security processes that I already have in place. And together with EY, we developed a Zero Trust Readiness Assessment that takes you along 19 questions where you can determine how good is my current environment and where should I stand. And this gives you a very good departing point of where should I focus on as an organization. And the other one is share successes and improvements, specifically when it comes to what we call the return on security investments. I see a lot of companies spend a lot of money into operational technology and buying equipment, and it is not utilized. It is utilized for approximately 10 to 20%. Count that with the 70, the average of 70 amount of tools that any organization has, is that you create a huge amount of insufficient, not utilized technology. And it's a waste of money because you still need to pay your maintenance for it. You need to keep training your personnel on it. And by identifying 5 segments and leveraging that over the other ones, you can easily determine, hey, what type of technology can I use, can I utilize better, or can I get rid of? And it's always a better storyline when you go to the CFO to determine how much money do we want to spend. I've also wrote an article about this, how to spend your security buck the most efficient way when you're working with rosy models. The other one is continuously assess silent and residual risk, something that the risk managers and compliance managers really want to do. And it also goes for if you have, for example, a cloud instance where you, for example, have containers or pipelines in the cloud, because you make use of existing logging of pipelines, for example, that you extract in the portal, you can immediately see, hey, in which team do we lack certain security measures. So it also gives you an overall status. And the other one is ensuring ownership at business and asset level. So there was one question about what is a critical precondition and what is the most important one, and that's the ownership. So I'm talking about ownership of the board supporting Zero Trust, because sometimes it's a long journey. But the other one is also asset ownership. If you have assets in your environment, but you don't have owners, it doesn't make sense to do anything. First, start seeking for the owner, and then corroborate with the owner, hey, how do we want to protect this? What are security measures that we want to use? Do you want additional security measures? Are you willing to pay for it? So really collaborate with the business also in terms of budgeting. And the last one is determining the change in operational cost, where also EY has a practice on benchmarking. What is the typical spend on the change process and what's the typical spend on the operational cost? For example, to determine if you want to outsource your SOC. And there's an important paper by Wakefield produced last year, where approximately 200 companies were examined, and the majority of the C-level people, so CEO and CFO, mentioned that 50% wants to outsource their SOC. And the same type of questioning you can also do to the CISO or to the security manager or to the SOC manager, but you can definitely get another answer. But so be aware of that. The majority of the C-level people want to outsource their SOC because they think it's inefficient, it's hard to maintain in terms of acquisition of talent, and it is really hard to maintain the war on more and more malicious malware going onto you and the more amount of events that you generate. We've wrote a lot of material, so papers and publications in all forms, in blogs, on events. We also have a active Zero Trust research team at the Antwerp University. Next week on Wednesday, for the people that want to participate, there is a specific research team, research panel required for Zero Trust in legacy environments. That's specifically a domain that they are examining. So what are measures that you need in a Zero Trust legacy environment? Or you want to utilize Zero Trust in legacy? How should I approach that? What should I do? What should I not do? There are also a lot of other different viewpoints on that. If you are interested, just let me know. And the other one is there's a Zero Trust CISO meetup that we do every month, where we do research in collaboration with CISOs. We've now had 120 CISOs in those sessions. And it was very, very fruitful because you get a lot of new insights on that. So if you are interested, just let me know. These are also a couple of papers. There was a question about how do you deal with Zero Trust in containerized environments. I think I really like that question because that's, to me, that's the new world, where we did, together with the University of Antwerp, Amsterdam in this case, the research group of Kees de Laat, we did an examination of Zero Trust in containerized environment to avoid lateral movements and which security measures you should apply in those environments. And we built a lab environment, tested it out, did the research publication on it, and it's now has become a practice. So the person that asked the question, we can send the paper, you can read it, and I'm sure you'll like it. And we have also a lot of other aligned practices like data protection and privacy, how you can use that within Zero Trust, etc. So how we're approaching the Q&A. I think we have a ton of questions. Hope we can address the best one. But it will be a tough thing to select. I don't know if Hao already looked at it. I have selected 6 relevant questions.
You already covered quite a lot, Yuri, but there are so many more in the chat actually. One of them, this one is for you, Yuri, I think, with the extensive implementation experience that you have. A lot of questions are about, the maturity level of an organization. That is there any minimal maturity level that you require to successfully implement a Zero Trust?
Yeah. It's a very good one, because I'm being approached by a lot of security officers and architects, all people in my own silo, all alike and choir alike people. But what I've seen is that the majority of the implementations that are successful, regardless where you depart from, we recently had a company that had a very, very immature level of information security, very, very immature, but there was actually a board member newly assigned, and he said, this is my project, this is where I want to commit to. And he was quite fearless in it, not only in terms of budget, but he was also very committed in making it successful and supporting his CISO. And they improved the company in a year to a very quite mature level. So it's not all about maturity, because it's more about how can you detect events more quickly, how can you make sure that the organization is better protected against internal threats, for example. Can I make more proper decisions, like what do I want to do with my SOC SIEM? Do I want to outsource it, or do I want to get rid of my SIEM? So more decisions like that. And he said, well, I free up my calendar every month for hard decisions that we need to make in terms of zero trust implementation. He was so convinced, and I think that's one of the most key ones. So if there's a certain level of knowledge and urgency and also commitment at that level, it's very easy. But if you don't have it, it's a very long journey, and then it remains in the silo of the architects and the technicians, what we see also most of the time.
I think that's a great view on that. There's another question. I think that's also close to the activities that you have, and I think next week you have a session around it as well. Maybe good to share. Questions about legacy systems, because a lot of systems are not from yesterday, but earlier than that. How do you implement zero trust on legacy systems?
Now, of course, a legacy system is a complete other beast when it comes for, if you want to apply, for example, identity and access management or federated access management to a legacy environment. Those are completely different systems. When we are approaching that in practice, we also most of the time ask the question, how long do you remain working with your legacy environment? Because you can also ring fence it and put it somewhere completely separated from the other new activities that you employ. On the other end, we also see organizations, the legacy is here for a longer time, we still make use of it. So we are going to apply practices like putting segmentation gateways in front of the zero trust environment, where you can still do a certain level of content inspection. You can still do a certain level of access management. It's all about building then the technology close to the data in the legacy, so close to the legacy system. And indeed, this research that we are doing with the University of Antwerp next Wednesday at 6 o'clock is led by a researcher working in the Ministry of Defense. And he is going to examine how can I use the zero trust framework, the ones that we've just presented, to enrich that with legacy practices. So if there are people in this audience as well that have expertise in legacy and also in zero trust security, you're more than welcome to participate. I'll be hosting the session, but there's a research group with a research lead who's doing the actual research.
All right, maybe one last question to you, Yuri. There was one question about an ultimate outcome of fully deployed zero trust model, but maybe to translate that, what would a dream look like in a zero trust world for you after implementation?
I really like that question. I think we should definitely give a book to Leo, because we talk a lot about activities that we employ or technology that we put in place, but we never talk about the outcome. When you compare it to CFOs or CEOs, they're all being accountable for the outcome. So in terms of security outcome, that means that you are capable of informing, for example, the CEO in minutes and not in hours. And we just recently did a paper on what we call key performance indicators and key risk indicators for zero trust. And we've identified a couple of them because these are more focused on the outcome. So how quick can you detect a certain incident. That means that you already are zero trusted, and your environment is already segmented. So how quick can you detect? How quick can you determine who is the owner being hit by, in terms of not only the data that's being hit, but also the segment owner, and how quick is he able to respond? Because most of the time we also see customers that if you have an event in the middle of the night and you want to call them, what shall we do? That you also want to make agreements with them. So the agreements between the SOC deliver, the service delivery of the SOC, regardless if you put it outside or you house it inside, and the consumer of the SOC, could be a business unit, but could also be a commercial customer. You need to make agreements on who's available if something happens in that segment. And those are typically outcome related ones, but yeah, ideally you don't want to see anything. If nothing happens, then you do your job well. If something happens, and then people wake up. And that's the less rewarding side of our work, unfortunately. Yeah, that's the profession that we choose. But there are definitely outcome related items.